Sometimes life comes down to a single dollar and the faith of a child. In the forgotten town of Cedar Hollow, where dreams had withered along with the crops, 6-year-old Lila clutched her last dollar bill and made a choice that would change everything. She bought an old red wagon at a yard sale. Paint was peeling off the sides, and the wheels squeaked with every turn. Her goose Chester waddled alongside as they pulled it home. Lila just wanted something to carry her grandmother's garden scraps. But when she filled that wagon with dying plants, something amazing happened. By morning, those same plants were green and growing strong. Word spread through town about the little girl whose vegetables grew like magic. People started coming to see for themselves. The old wagon seemed to bring life back to anything it touched. Soon, the whole community was talking about miracles happening right in their backyards. But could one small girl really save an entire town from giving up? Hope? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Hollow had once been the kind of place where children played, until the streetlights came on and neighbors knew each other's middle names. Now, as the morning sun cast long shadows across empty storefronts and cracked sidewalks, the town felt like a photograph left too long in the sun. Faded, brittle, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Lila pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the dust swirl in lazy circles down Main Street. Below in the kitchen, she could hear Grandmother Martha moving about with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the things that mattered most. The floorboards creaked their familiar morning song, a sound that had greeted 3 generations of women in this weathered farmhouse. Chester honked softly from his spot by the back door, his white feathers catching the early light. The goose had arrived the previous spring as a tiny gosling, abandoned and barely alive when Lila found him by the dried creek bed. Now he stood nearly as tall as her waist, his neck curved in that elegant way that made Martha smile and say, he looked like he was posing for a painting. "Come on, Chester," Lila whispered, padding down the creaking stairs in her bare feet. "Grandma's making biscuits." The kitchen held the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread and the sharper scent of coffee, percolating on the old gas stove. Martha stood at the counter, her silver hair pinned back with the same tortoise-shell combs she'd worn since her wedding day 43 years ago. Her hands, weathered from decades of garden work and cooking, moved with practiced efficiency as she rolled out biscuit dough. "Morning, little bird," Martha said without turning around. She'd always known when Lila entered a room, claimed it was something about the way the air changed when someone you love comes near. "Chester's been asking for you for the past 10 minutes. The goose had indeed been honking with increasing urgency, performing his morning dance of importance that never failed to make Lila giggle. She opened the back door, and Chester waddled inside, immediately settling at her feet with a satisfied ruffle of his feathers. Through the kitchen window, Lila could see the garden that had once been Martha's pride and joy. The tomato plants drooped despite yesterday's watering, their leaves curled and yellowing. The bean poles stood like bare skeletons, and the squash vines had given up entirely, their broad leaves brown and crispy at the edges. Even the sunflowers, which had always grown tall and proud along the back fence, barely reached Lila's shoulder this year. "The Hendersons are selling," Martha said quietly, following Lila's gaze. "Mrs. Peterson told me yesterday at the post office. 3 generations on that land, and now it's going to become another subdivision for folks who work in the city." Lila had played in the Hendersons' apple orchard just last summer, climbing trees and sharing the sweet, crisp fruit with Chester. Now those same trees stood bare and brittle, victims of the same mysterious blight that had taken hold of gardens throughout Cedar Hollow. Martha's recipe box sat open on the counter, its corners soft with age, and its index cards yellowed from decades of use. Some of the recipes had been written in her grandmother's careful script, others in her own mother's flowing hand, and the newest ones in Martha's practical printing. Each card told a story of Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and the simple, everyday meals that bind families together across generations. "Grandma," Lila said, tracing patterns in the flour that had dusted the counter, "why don't things grow like they used to?" Martha paused in her biscuit-making, her hands still for a moment. It was the kind of question that deserved more than a simple answer, the kind that required choosing words carefully because children remember everything, especially the things adults think they've forgotten. "Sometimes," Martha said, sitting down at the kitchen table and patting her lap so Lila could climb up, "the earth gets tired. Like people do. Your grandfather used to say that land has a memory, and when bad things happen to it, that memory gets stored up in the soil." She gestured toward the window, where the morning light revealed more clearly the extent of the garden's struggle. The old-timers in town, they remember when Cedar Creek ran year-round, when the fishing was good and the soil was black and rich. But then the big companies came, looking for oil and gas and other things buried deep. They dug and drilled and took what they wanted, and maybe they took more than they should have. Lila leaned back against her grandmother's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. Chester had settled himself against Martha's legs, forming a small circle of warmth and contentment in the morning kitchen. "But the earth wants to grow," Martha continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It's always reaching toward the light, always trying to make something beautiful from whatever it's given. Sometimes it just needs someone to believe in it again." The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted their quiet moment. Mayor Johnson's distinctive knock, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, echoed through the house. Martha set Lila gently on her feet and went to answer the door, Chester following close behind, with his head held high in his official greeting stance. Mayor Johnson stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with the kind of worry that had become permanent in the past few years. Behind him, the morning sun illuminated the empty lot where Morrison's general store used to stand, its absence like a missing tooth in the town's smile. "Morning, Martha," he said, his voice carrying the weight of difficult news. "Hope I'm not interrupting breakfast." "Never too early for friends, Bill," Martha replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Coffee's fresh." But Lila could see the tension in her grandmother's shoulders, the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, as if needing something solid to hold on to. Chester sensed it too, pressing closer to Martha's legs with a soft, worried honk. In the kitchen, Mayor Johnson accepted the offered cup of coffee but didn't sit down, a sign that whatever brought him here couldn't be softened by the comfort of familiar surroundings. His eyes kept drifting to Lila, who had claimed her usual spot at the table, with Chester settled beside her chair. "Martha," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his words carefully. "The county's been asking questions about property taxes, about the state of some of the older homes. They're talking about declaring certain areas blighted, which would mean forced sales," Martha finished quietly. "Now, it's not decided yet," Mayor Johnson said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "There are procedures, appeals. But, Martha, with your medical bills from last spring and the way the garden's been struggling, how long?" Martha asked. 6 months, maybe 8 if we can find a lawyer willing to work with us. But Martha, the truth is, most folks are starting to think it might be for the best. Move closer to the city, closer to doctors and jobs and leave. Cedar Hollow to die, Martha said, but without anger. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken with the weariness of someone who had watched too much change too quickly. Lila looked between the 2 adults, understanding more than they realized. She had heard the whispered conversations late at night, had seen the stack of bills on Martha's desk, growing higher each month. She knew about the letter from the bank that had made Martha sit down hard in her chair and stare at the wall for a long, quiet hour. But she also knew about the way Chester seemed to understand when she was sad, the way he would press his warm body against her legs until the sadness felt smaller. She knew about the morning glories that still bloomed by the kitchen window, defying all logic and drought. She knew about the feeling she got sometimes when she walked through the garden, as if something was waiting, holding its breath, ready to burst into life if given just the right chance. "Mayor Johnson," Lila said, surprising both adults with the seriousness in her young voice. "Do you think the earth is really tired? Or do you think maybe it's just waiting for someone to remember how to help it grow?" The mayor looked at her with the kind of attention adults usually reserved for other adults, recognizing something in her question that went deeper than childhood curiosity. Chester honked softly, as if adding his own opinion to the conversation. "No, little miss," he said slowly. "I think maybe you're onto something there. Maybe what we need isn't to give up, but to remember what we used to know about taking care of things that matter." Martha's hand found Lila's shoulder, squeezing gently. Through the kitchen window, the struggling garden seemed to shimmer in the morning light, as if possibility itself was dancing on the edges of what could be seen. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the white sheets snapping in the warm breeze like surrender flags against the cloudless sky. Lila sat in the garden with Chester, carefully examining each tomato plant and whispering encouragement to the ones that looked particularly discouraged. "Maybe if we sing to them," she told Chester, who tilted his head as if seriously considering the suggestion. "Mama used to sing lullabies to me when I couldn't sleep. Maybe plants need lullabies too." She had just begun humming a half-remembered tune when she heard the sound, a soft thud followed by silence, the kind of silence that makes the world hold its breath. Chester heard it too, his neck stretching tall as he looked toward the house with sudden alertness. "Grandma?" Lila called, but received no answer. She found Martha collapsed beside the laundry basket, one hand pressed against her chest, her face pale as the sheets that lay scattered around her. Chester arrived moments later, honking with distress as he circled Martha's still form. "Grandma, wake up," Lila whispered, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. Martha's fingers felt cold despite the warm morning, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. What followed was a blur of sirens and strange voices, of paramedics asking questions Lila couldn't answer, and neighbors appearing from nowhere to wrap her in worried hugs. Mrs. Peterson from next door took charge with the quiet efficiency of someone who had weathered many storms, calling the hospital and gathering Martha's medications, while Lila sat on the front steps with Chester pressed against her side. The ambulance disappeared down the dusty road, taking Martha and leaving behind a silence that felt different from any quiet Lila had ever known. This wasn't the comfortable silence of early morning or the peaceful quiet of evening. This was the silence of things breaking, of worlds shifting in ways that couldn't be undone. "Your grandmother's going to need surgery," Dr. Williams explained, gently when he called that evening. Lila held Mrs. Peterson's hand as they sat in the neighbor's kitchen, Chester at their feet like a faithful guardian. "Her heart is working too hard. Has been for a while now. We can fix it, but she'll need to stay here for several weeks, maybe longer." "Can I visit her?" Lila asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Mrs. Peterson's grip tightened. On her hand, "The hospital is 3 hours away, sweetheart. And with your grandmother's medical insurance, well, there are going to be some difficult decisions to make." After Mrs. Peterson hung up the phone, they sat in the growing darkness without turning on the lights. Through the kitchen window, Lila could see her own house across the yard, looking abandoned and lonely with all its windows dark. "The medical bills," Mrs. Peterson said quietly, more to herself than to Lila. "Even with Medicare, heart surgery costs. Oh, Martha, what are we going to do?" That night, Lila lay in the narrow bed in Mrs. Peterson's spare room, staring at the ceiling and listening to Chester's restless movements on the floor beside her. The goose hadn't eaten since morning, hadn't even shown interest in the corn Mrs. Peterson had scattered for him. He seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed, that the safe, predictable rhythm of their days had been shattered. The next morning brought Mr. Crawford from the bank, his black sedan looking ominous as it pulled into the driveway. He was a thin man with careful eyes, the kind of person who had learned to deliver bad news with professional sympathy. "I'm sorry about Martha's condition," he said, sitting across from Mrs. Peterson at her kitchen table while Lila pretended to color at the counter. "But you understand, the mortgage payments haven't been made in 3 months, with the additional medical expenses—" "How long?" Mrs. Peterson interrupted, saving him from having to explain what everyone already understood. 6 weeks, Mr. Crawford said. "Maybe 8 if we can work out a payment plan. But honestly, given the condition of the property and the current market, it might be better for everyone if Martha considered selling while she still has options." After he left, Lila stood at the window watching her house across the yard. You see, Red Wagon sat beside the back door where she had left it yesterday morning, bright against the weathered siding. Suddenly, she understood what needed to happen. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, turning from the window with the kind of determination that sometimes surprises adults, "I need to go home for a while." "Oh, honey, I don't think that's just for an hour. Chester needs to check on his favorite spots. And I need to water Grandma's plants. They'll die if nobody takes care of them." Mrs. Peterson looked uncertain, but Chester was already at the door, honking with what sounded remarkably like agreement. "Well, I suppose for a little while, but you stay in the yard and come back if anything seems wrong." Walking across the familiar yard felt like crossing into a different world. Everything looked the same, but felt hollow somehow, as if the house was holding its breath. Chester waddled straight to his favorite dust bath spot and settled in with a satisfied ruffle of his feathers, claiming his territory in the face of uncertainty. Lila went to the garden and began her inspection. The tomato plants looked worse than yesterday, their leaves drooping despite the morning dew. The peppers had developed black spots on their stems, and the beans hadn't grown at all in the past week. It was as if Martha's collapse had somehow affected the plants too, as if they had been drawing strength from her presence and were now failing in her absence. "It's okay," Lila whispered, kneeling beside the most struggling tomato plant. "Grandma's going to get better, and then everything will be fine again." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't that simple. Even if Martha recovered completely, there would still be the bills, the bank, the reality that everything was slipping away like sand through fingers. That's when she noticed the broken feather lying beside Chester's dust bath. It was one of his wing feathers, longer and more elegant than the others, with a crack running through the center that hadn't been there yesterday. Chester was favoring his left wing slightly, she realized, as if something had frightened or hurt him during the chaos of the previous day. Lila picked up the feather carefully, turning it in the morning light. Like everything else she loved, Chester was showing signs of damage, small wounds that might not heal if left untended. "We have to do something," she told him, and he looked at her with those bright, intelligent eyes, as if he understood exactly what she meant. She fetched the wagon from beside the house, its rusty wheels squeaking in protest as she pulled it across the yard. Working methodically, she began loading it with the most distressed plants from Martha's garden. The tomatoes with yellowing leaves, the pepper plants with spotted stems, the bean vines that had stopped climbing their poles. Chester watched with interest as she arranged the plants carefully in the wagon bed, making sure each one had enough room and wasn't crushed by its neighbors. When she was finished, the wagon looked like a mobile hospital ward for dying vegetation. "Now what?" she asked Chester, but the goose was already moving, waddling toward the old well at the far edge of the property. The well hadn't been used in years, not since the county had required everyone to connect to the municipal water system. But Martha's grandfather had dug it by hand more than a century ago, and Martha had always maintained it was the sweetest water in the county. Now it sat covered by a heavy wooden lid, forgotten, but not quite abandoned. Chester honked softly and looked meaningfully from Lila to the well and back again. She wasn't sure what he was trying to tell her, but she had learned to trust the goose's instincts about things that mattered. "You think the plants need different water?" she asked. Chester honked again, more urgently this time, and began walking in tight circles around the well cover. Lila managed to shift the heavy lid enough to peer down into the darkness below. The water level was higher than she had expected, and in the shadowy depths she could see her own reflection wavering like a ghost. On impulse, she dipped her hands into the cool water and sprinkled it over the plants in the wagon. Nothing happened immediately, but Chester settled down beside the wagon with a satisfied expression, as if something important had been accomplished. "Tomorrow morning," Lila told him, "we'll see if you're as smart as Grandma always said you were." That night, lying in Mrs. Peterson's spare bed, Lila dreamed of gardens growing so tall they touched the sky, of Chester flying even though everyone knew geese preferred to keep their feet on solid ground, of Martha coming home to find the whole world green and growing and full of impossible life. Dawn came soft and golden through Mrs. Peterson's lace curtains, but Lila was already awake, pressed against the window with Chester beside her on the narrow sill. They had been watching the yard for the first hint of light, both anxious to see what the night might have brought. The moment the sun cleared the horizon, Lila was out the door with Chester waddling urgently beside her. Mrs. Peterson's calls to wait for breakfast went unheeded as they hurried across the dewy grass toward the garden where the wagon waited. What they found there made Lila stop so suddenly that Chester bumped into her legs with a concerned honk. The tomato plants that had been drooping and yellow yesterday now stood straight and strong, their leaves a deep, healthy green that seemed to glow in the morning light. The pepper plants had lost their black spots entirely, and their stems looked thick and robust. Most miraculous of all, the bean vines had not only resumed their climb up the poles, but had grown several inches overnight, their heart-shaped leaves unfurling with obvious vigor. "Chester," Lila whispered, reaching out to touch one of the tomato leaves with trembling fingers. It felt solid and real, cool with morning dew, and unmistakably alive in a way that yesterday's wilted plants had not. "Bean?" The goose preened his feathers with satisfaction, as if to say he had known all along that the old well water was special. His broken wing feather from yesterday had somehow mended itself too, Lila noticed. The crack sealed so perfectly it was as if it had never been damaged at all. Mrs. Peterson found them there 20 minutes later, having followed the sound of Chester's excited honking. She stopped at the edge of the garden, her hand pressed to her heart in an echo of Martha's gesture from 2 days ago. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed, moving closer to examine the transformed plants. "Lila, honey, what did you do?" "We just gave them water from Grandpa's well," Lila said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood they didn't adequately explain what had happened. Chester thought they might like it better than the water from the house. Mrs. Peterson knelt beside the wagon, running her weathered hands over the healthy leaves with something approaching reverence. She had been gardening for 60 years, had coaxed life from reluctant soil through drought and flood and every challenge the weather could devise. But she had never seen plants respond to anything the way these had responded to whatever power lived in that old wagon. "We need to tell someone," she said finally, though her voice was uncertain. "Dr. Williams should know about this, or maybe the county extension agent." "No," Lila said quickly, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "Not yet. First, I want to see if it works for other people too." She was thinking of the Henderson's orchard, where the apple trees stood bare and dying, despite every effort to save them. If the wagon could heal Martha's vegetables, maybe it could heal other growing things too. Maybe there was hope for more than just their little garden. Chester seemed to understand her intention because he immediately began walking toward the property line that separated Martha's land from the Henderson farm. His steps were purposeful, almost ceremonial, as if he were leading a procession of great importance. "Mrs. Peterson," Lila said, making the kind of decision that feels both terrifying and inevitable, "can you help me get these plants to the Hendersons? I think Chester wants to show them something." The Henderson farm sprawled across 50 acres that had been in the family since the 1920s. when Paul Henderson's grandfather had arrived from Oklahoma with nothing but determination and a fierce love for growing things. Now Paul stood among his dying apple trees with the same bewildered expression that had become common on the faces of farmers throughout Cedar Hollow. The trees that had produced bushels of crisp, sweet fruit just 5 years ago now looked like monuments to failure. Their bark was split and grey, their branches brittle, their leaves, where any remained, brown and curled at the edges. Paul had tried everything: new fertilizers, different watering schedules, soil amendments recommended by experts from the state university. Nothing had made any difference. "Paul," Mrs. Peterson called as they approached, the wagon squeaking its rusty song behind them. "We wanted to show you something that might interest you." Paul looked up from where he had been examining the base of one particularly damaged tree, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to amazement as he saw the plants in Lila's wagon. The healthy green of the leaves seemed almost aggressive in their vitality, a stark contrast to the death that surrounded them. "Good Lord," he said, approaching the wagon with the careful steps of someone afraid that what they're seeing might disappear if approached too quickly. "Martha's vegetables? But yesterday they were. I saw them when I drove by, and they look just like everything else around here." "Lila has a theory about what they needed," Mrs. Peterson said, gesturing toward the little girl who stood beside the wagon with Chester at her side. "Show him, honey." Without being asked, Chester waddled to the base of the nearest apple tree and began honking in short, urgent bursts. His meaning was so clear that Paul actually laughed, despite his confusion. "He wants me to let you try something." "With this tree?" Paul asked. Lila nodded solemnly. "Chester thinks the water from our old well might help. Grandma always said it was the sweetest water in the county, and these plants got better overnight after we watered them with it." Paul looked from the dying tree to the thriving vegetables to the serious face of the 6-year-old who was proposing what sounded like folk magic. Any other day he might have smiled politely and changed the subject, but today, with foreclosure, papers on his kitchen table, and a lifetime of farming knowledge proving useless against whatever was killing his land, he was willing to consider possibilities that would have seemed ridiculous a week ago. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Working together, they carefully lifted one of the healthiest tomato plants from the wagon and positioned it at the base of the apple tree. Lila produced a small mason jar filled with well water that she had thought to bring along, and poured it slowly around both the tomato plant's roots and the tree's base. Chester supervised the operation with the intensity of a general directing troops, honking approval when they positioned the plant correctly and falling silent when they usado. Last drops of well water soaked into the thirsty soil. "Now we wait?" Paul asked. "Now we wait," Lila confirmed. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the tomato plant seemed to settle into its new location with obvious contentment, its leaves growing perceptibly greener even as they watched. But more remarkably, the apple tree began to show subtle signs of response. The grey bark took on warmer tones, and tiny buds that had been dormant began to swell with new life. Paul knelt beside the tree, running his hands over bark that had felt dead and brittle just moments before. Now it had a subtle warmth to it, a sense of life stirring just beneath the surface. "How is this possible?" he whispered, though he wasn't really asking for an explanation. Some things, he was beginning to understand, didn't require explanation as much as they required acceptance. "Sometimes," Lila said, unconsciously echoing Martha's words from a few days before, "things just need someone to believe in them again." Chester honked his agreement and began walking toward the next tree in the orchard, his manner suggesting that they had a great deal of work ahead of them if they were going to save the whole farm by dinner time. As word of the morning's events began to spread through the quiet networks that connect rural communities, other neighbors started arriving with various excuses to check on the Hendersons. They came to borrow tools or return borrowed items, to ask about the weather or share news about mutual friends. But what they really came for was to see if the stories they had heard were true. By noon, a small crowd had gathered around the apple, tree where Lila had performed her first deliberate healing. The tree now looked unmistakably healthier, its branches showing green buds and its bark displaying the healthy color that had been absent for years. The tomato plant at its base had grown visibly, as if drawing strength from its partnership with the old tree and giving strength in return. Chester basked in the attention, accepting admiration and gentle pats from the assembled neighbors with the dignity of someone who had always known he was destined for great things. Mayor Johnson arrived just as Lila was preparing to attempt healing a second tree. He had heard the reports from 3 different sources and had driven out to see for himself what was causing such excitement among people who had grown accustomed to disappointment. He stood watching as Lila carefully positioned another healthy plant from her wagon beside a dying apple tree, Chester supervising every step with obvious importance. The ritual had taken on a ceremonial quality that felt both ancient and utterly natural. "Well, I'll be," Mayor Johnson murmured as the tree began to respond to the treatment, its dead-looking branches showing the first hints of returning life. "Bill," Paul Henderson said quietly, drawing the mayor aside, "I've been farming this land for 30 years. My father farmed it for 40 years before me. We've seen droughts and floods, early freezes and late springs, every kind of weather and soil, condition you can imagine. But I've never seen anything like this." "What are you thinking?" Mayor Johnson asked, though his eyes remained fixed on the little girl who was now explaining to Chester that they needed to pace themselves if they were going to help all the trees without exhausting their supply of well water. "I'm thinking," Paul said slowly, "that maybe we've been looking for solutions in all the wrong places. Maybe what we needed was right here all along, and we just needed someone young enough to believe in impossible things." Chester honked his approval of this assessment, and Lila looked up from her work with the kind of smile that makes adults remember what hope feels like. Word of the miracle in the Henderson orchard spread through Cedar Hollow with the swift certainty of sunrise. By evening, the community bulletin board at Murphy's gas station, the unofficial communications hub for anyone who lived more than shouting distance from their neighbors, had acquired a small cluster of handwritten notes. "Saw Paul Henderson's apple trees this morning. Something different happening there. J. Morrison. Anyone know what Martha's granddaughter did to those plants? Asking for a friend. Anonymous. Meeting at the community center Sunday after church. Discussion of recent gardening developments." Mayor B. Johnson, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had driven down from the State University to investigate reports that struck her as either elaborate hoaxes or examples of mass hysteria. As a plant pathologist with 20 years of experience diagnosing agricultural diseases, she had seen her share of desperate farmers grasping at miracle cures. What she hadn't expected was to find legitimate evidence of plant recovery that defied every scientific principle she understood. She arrived at the Henderson farm on Thursday morning with a truck full of testing equipment and a notebook full of skeptical questions. She left 4 hours later with soil samples, plant specimens, water samples from Martha's old well, and a worldview that had been thoroughly challenged. "The cellular regeneration is unprecedented," she told Mayor Johnson over coffee at the town's single remaining diner. "I've never seen plant tissue recover from this level of damage, especially not this quickly. And the water from that well, there's something in the mineral composition that doesn't match anything in the geological surveys of this area." "So you're saying it's real?" Mayor Johnson asked. "I'm saying it's real, and I have no idea how it works," Dr. Mitchell replied, which was as close to endorsing magic as her scientific training would allow. Meanwhile, Lila had established a routine that gave shape to her days while Martha remained in the distant hospital. Each morning, she and Chester would visit the old well, filling mason jars with the sweet, cool water that seemed to hold such power. Then they would make their rounds through town, pulling the squeaky red wagon to wherever healing was needed most. The wagon itself had become a source of fascination for the growing number of visitors who came to witness what local newspapers had begun calling the Cedar Hollow phenomenon. Children especially were drawn to it, running their hands along its rust-spotted sides and asking Lila if it was magic. "I don't think it's the wagon that's magic," Lila would tell them seriously. "I think it's about caring for things that need help." Chester had appointed himself as official greeter for all visitors, a role he performed with considerable dignity. He seemed to understand that people needed to see him almost as much as they needed to see the healing plants, as if his presence confirmed that the impossible things they were witnessing were somehow grounded in the familiar world of barnyard, animals and childhood companions. Tom Bradley had brought his 8-year-old daughter Emma to see the miracle plants on a day when her chemotherapy treatments had left her too weak to attend school. Emma had been fighting leukemia for 6 months, and the treatments that were supposed to save her life were making her feel like she was disappearing a little more each day. "Can I touch them?" Emma asked, reaching tentatively toward a tomato plant that practically glowed with health. "Chester says it's okay," Lila replied, which was the closest thing to official permission that anyone seemed to need these days. Emma's fingers were gentle on the leaves, her touch reverent in the way that sick people touch things that represent perfect health. Chester settled beside her wheelchair, offering his neck for stroking with the instinctive kindness that made him beloved throughout the community. "Do you think," Emma asked quietly, "that if I ate some of these vegetables, they might help me get better too?" It was the kind of question that made adults exchange worried glances over children's heads, the kind of hope that seemed both heartbreaking and dangerous to encourage. But Lila, who had not yet learned to temper hope with adult caution, simply nodded. "Grandma always said that food grown with love tastes different," she said, "and these plants have been loved a lot." Tom Bradley found himself returning to the Henderson farm every few days, drawn by something more complex than his daughter's obvious improvement in spirits. Emma was eating better since she had started having salads made from Lila's vegetables, sleeping more soundly, laughing more frequently at things that should have been funny. Her doctors couldn't explain the improvement in her blood work, but they weren't questioning it either. "There's something about this place," he told Paul Henderson one afternoon as they watched their daughters play with Chester in the orchard. "Something that makes you believe things might work out after all." Paul nodded, understanding completely. His apple trees were now showing new growth throughout the orchard, their branches heavy with blossoms that had appeared weeks ahead of schedule. The transformation was so dramatic that agricultural reporters were beginning to make pilgrimages to document what some were calling the fastest agricultural recovery in recorded history. But for Paul, the miracle wasn't really about the trees. It was about the way his neighbors had started stopping by again, the way people who had been talking about leaving town were suddenly making plans for next year's planting season. It was about the return of something that had been missing from Cedar Hollow for too long, the sense that the future might hold better days. Dr. Mitchell had extended her stay indefinitely, setting up a temporary research station in an unused classroom at the elementary school. Her initial skepticism had evolved into scientific fascination, and she was documenting changes in soil composition, plant growth rates, and water quality that challenged fundamental assumptions about agricultural science. "I'm going to need to bring in colleagues," she told Mayor Johnson. "Soil scientists, hydrologists, maybe even some folks from the geology department. What's happening here needs proper documentation." The bulletin board at Murphy's gas station had evolved into something resembling a community newspaper, with updates posted daily about the progress of various healing projects around town. Mrs. Peterson had started an informal coordination system, matching people who needed help with their gardens to available slots in Lila's increasingly busy schedule. Tuesday, Henderson Orchard Section C, Wednesday, Morrison's Vegetable Garden, Thursday, Community Center Flower Beds. The careful handwriting belonged to Mrs. Peterson, who had taken on the role of unofficial scheduler with the same efficiency. She brought to organizing church potlucks and volunteer firefighter fundraisers. Chester had adapted to his new celebrity status with remarkable grace, though he maintained certain standards about how he expected to be treated. He would accept gentle petting from children and respectful admiration from adults, but he drew the line at being picked up or having his picture taken without his consent, which he indicated through a complex system of honks and head movements that Lila had learned to interpret with perfect accuracy. The old well had become a site of pilgrimage for visitors from neighboring towns who came hoping to witness the source of Cedar Hollow's transformation. Lila had established strict rules about its use. Only she could draw water from it, and only for the purposes of helping sick plants recover their health. Chester enforced these rules with the dedication of a security guard, positioning himself between the well and any unauthorized visitors. Martha's recipe box, which Mrs. Peterson had brought over for safekeeping, had taken on new significance as people began asking about the family's history with the well. The oldest cards, written in faded ink by Martha's grandmother, contained references to blessed water and healing springs that had seemed like folklore until recently. Every generation of women in that family has been known for their way with growing things, Mrs. Peterson told Dr. Mitchell one afternoon as they watched Lila work her particular magic on a struggling rose bush. Martha's grandmother could make anything bloom, even in the worst drought years. Her mother too. And now Lila, well, you can see for yourself. Dr. Mitchell was beginning to suspect that the scientific explanation she had been seeking might be more complex than simple mineral composition or soil chemistry. There was something about the intentionality behind Lila's work, the care she took with each plant, the way she seemed to communicate with Chester about which treatments were needed where, that suggested factors beyond what could be measured in a laboratory. The transformation wasn't limited to plants. People throughout Cedar Hollow were reporting better sleep, improved appetites, and a general sense of well-being that couldn't be attributed to anything they could identify. Children were spending more time outdoors, adults were lingering longer in conversations with neighbors, and the pessimistic mood that had settled over the town like fog was gradually lifting. Tom Bradley had documented Emma's progress with the thoroughness of a man who was afraid to trust what he was seeing. Her energy levels had increased dramatically since she started eating vegetables from Lila's healing garden. Her appetite had returned with a vengeance, and she was sleeping through the night for the first time since her treatments had begun. "Sir, doctors want to know what we're doing differently," he told Lila one afternoon as Emma played with Chester in the shade of a newly healthy apple tree. "They can't explain why her numbers are improving so much faster than expected." Lila considered this seriously, absently stroking Chester's neck as she thought. "Maybe," she said finally, "it's not about explaining it. Maybe it's just about believing that good things can happen when you take care of each other." Chester honked his agreement, and Emma laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and more genuine with each passing day. As the sun set over Cedar Hollow that evening, casting long golden shadows across gardens that were thriving for the first time in years, the transformation was visible from almost every angle. Where once there had been brown, brittle vegetation and bare soil, now there were patches of green that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The red wagon sat beside Martha's back door, exactly where it had been the morning everything changed. But now it rested like a symbol of hope rather than an abandoned toy. Its rust and squeaky wheels badges of honor earned through faithful service to a community that was learning to believe in miracles again. And in the growing darkness, Chester settled himself beside the old well with the satisfaction of a job well done, keeping watch over the source of wonders that had brought his beloved Lila's world back to life. Dr. Mitchell's research team arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt electric with possibility and tension. 3 vehicles filled with scientific equipment pulled into the Henderson farm, followed by a news van from the regional television station and 2 cars carrying reporters from agricultural journals. The quiet miracle that had been unfolding in Cedar Hollow was about to be examined under the bright lights of public scrutiny. Lila watched the arrival from her perch on the front porch of Mrs. Peterson's house. Chester settled beside her like a feathered sentinel. The goose had grown increasingly protective as more strangers appeared in their small world, and his usual friendly demeanor had been replaced by a wariness that made Lila feel nervous too. "Too many people," she whispered to Chester, who honked softly in agreement. Martha's wedding ring caught the morning light from where it sat on the kitchen table next to a stack of medical bills that seemed to grow taller each day. Mrs. Peterson had been avoiding the subject, but Lila had overheard the phone conversations with the hospital billing department, the careful negotiations about payment plans, and the gentle questions about Martha's insurance coverage. The ring had been worn smooth by 43 years of marriage, its simple gold band polished by decades of kneading bread, tending gardens, and all the small daily gestures that make up a life. Now it represented Martha's last asset, the final thing that could be sold to buy more time. Dr. Mitchell approached the porch with the careful movements of someone who understood she was dealing with something fragile and unprecedented. Her team began setting up equipment in the Henderson orchard, while she came to speak with the little girl who had become the center of scientific attention she had never sought. "Hello, Lila," Dr. Mitchell said, settling into the porch chair beside her. "I hope it's okay that I brought some friends to help me understand what's happening here." Chester eyed the scientist with the suspicion reserved for people who asked too many questions, but he didn't honk disapproval, which Lila interpreted as cautious acceptance. "Are they going to hurt the plants?" Lila asked, watching as researchers in white coats began taking samples from the apple trees. "No, honey, we just want to learn how you've been helping them get better. What you're doing is very special, and if we can understand it better, maybe we can help other places where plants are struggling." It was a reasonable explanation, offered with genuine kindness, but Lila felt something twist uncomfortably in her stomach. The idea of turning what felt like a natural gift into something that could be studied and replicated somehow seemed wrong, like trying to bottle starlight or measure the weight of a lullaby. "Chester doesn't like it when strangers touch his plants," she said finally. Dr. Mitchell looked at the goose, who had positioned himself between the porch and the orchard with obvious territorial intent. "I can see that. Maybe Chester could help us understand what we should and shouldn't do." This was the right thing to say, apparently, because Chester preened slightly and honked what sounded like grudging approval. By afternoon, the quiet farm had been transformed into something resembling a scientific encampment. Soil samples were being analyzed in a mobile laboratory. Water from Martha's well was undergoing chemical testing, and researchers were measuring everything from soil pH to ambient electromagnetic fields. The television crew was interviewing anyone who would speak to them about the Cedar Hollow miracle, a phrase that made Lila wince every time she heard it. She wasn't performing miracles, she wanted to tell them. She was just helping things that needed help, the same way anyone would help an injured bird or a lost dog. Paul Henderson found himself in the uncomfortable position of spokesman for phenomena. He didn't fully understand himself. Standing in his transformed orchard, surrounded by trees that had gone from near death to vibrant health in a matter of weeks, he tried to explain to reporters what it felt like to witness impossible things becoming possible. "It's not just about the plants," he said, gesturing toward apple trees heavy with unseasonably early fruit. "It's about remembering that some things can't be explained, only experienced. That little girl and her goose, they reminded us that faith isn't about understanding everything. Sometimes it's about trusting that good things can happen even when you can't see how." Corporate representatives had begun arriving too, though they were less obvious about their purposes. Men in expensive suits toured the orchard with cameras and measuring devices, asking careful questions about water rights and mineral compositions. They introduced themselves as agricultural consultants or environmental researchers, but their interest seemed more commercial than scientific. Chester had appointed himself official greeter for all these visitors, but his greeting style had evolved. From friendly welcome to stern evaluation, he would approach each newcomer, study them with those bright, intelligent eyes, and then either honk approval or position himself as a barrier between them and whatever they wanted to examine. The scientists generally passed Chester's inspection. The corporate representatives did not. Martha's condition had stabilized enough for her to make phone calls, and she spoke with Lila every evening at 6 o'clock sharp. But the conversations were different now, shadowed by the knowledge that time was running short and decisions would soon need to be made about things no 6-year-old should have to worry about. "Are you taking care of Chester?" Martha asked during their Tuesday night call. "Chester's taking care of me," Lila replied, which was more true than either of them wanted to acknowledge. "And the garden? The garden's taking care of itself now. Mostly. But Grandma, there are so many people here now, and they all want to know how we made the plants better, and Chester doesn't like some of them very much." Martha was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "Baby bird, sometimes when something special happens, other people want to make it belong to them instead of letting it belong to itself. You and Chester, you just keep doing what feels right to you. Don't let anyone tell you that what you're doing is wrong or that it needs to be done differently. But what if they try to make us stop? Then you remember that the most important things can't be stopped by people who don't understand them. Love can't be stopped. Caring can't be stopped, growing can't be stopped, and whatever you and Chester have been doing, it comes from all of those things." After the phone call, Lila sat in the gathering dusk with Chester beside her, watching. The lights from the research encampment twinkle like fallen stars across the Henderson farm. In the distance, she could hear the hum of generators powering equipment that was designed to measure and analyze the unmeasurable. Mrs. Peterson found them there an hour later, 2 small figures silhouetted against the enormous sky. "Lot of fuss." "Over there," she said, settling onto the porch step beside them. "Too much fuss," Lila agreed. Chester honked softly, a sound that somehow conveyed both agreement and reassurance. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "Mrs. Peterson," Lila said suddenly, "what happens if Grandma can't come home?" It was the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for days, and Mrs. Peterson felt the weight of needing to answer it honestly without destroying the hope that had been sustaining them all. "I don't know, honey," she said finally, "but I know that whatever happens, you won't be alone. This whole community has seen what you can do, and we're not going to let anything bad happen to you or Chester, even if the bank takes the house. Even then. Sometimes when one door closes, another one opens that leads somewhere better than you ever imagined." Chester settled more closely against Lila's legs, and she felt the steady warmth of his presence like an anchor in an uncertain world. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more tests, more people who wanted to understand or possess or profit from the simple gift of helping things grow. But tonight, sitting on the porch with the 2 people, one human, one goose, who loved her most in all the world, Lila felt the same quiet certainty that had guided her to buy the wagon with her last dollar. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, and somehow that would be enough. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday morning that started with promise and ended with heartbreak. Mr. Crawford from the bank delivered it personally. His black sedan, a stark contrast to the vibrant gardens that had transformed the neighborhood around Martha's house. He handled the legal document with the grim efficiency of someone who had performed this particular duty too many times to take any satisfaction in it. Mrs. Peterson read the notice twice, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the clinical language that spelled the end of everything familiar. 30 days. After 3 generations, after all the love and labor that had been poured into the weathered farmhouse and its surrounding land, They had 30 days to find a miracle that had nothing to do with healing plants. The old farmhouse. Deed lay spread on the kitchen table beside Martha's wedding ring, the legal description of property boundaries and mineral rights written in the careful, copperplate handwriting of a long-dead county clerk. It was a document that had never seemed particularly important, just a piece of paper that confirmed what everyone already knew about who owned what and where the lines were drawn. But now, facing the reality of losing everything, Mrs. Peterson found herself studying the deed with the intensity of someone searching for hidden treasure. The legal language was dense and archaic, full of references to heirs and assigns, and appurtenances thereunto belonging, that seemed to belong to a more formal age. Lila sat at the table with Chester at her feet, watching Mrs. Peterson's face for clues about what the papers meant. She understood enough to know that bad news had arrived in an official envelope, but the specifics remained clouded in adult worries that no one seemed willing to explain in words a 6-year-old could grasp. "Mrs. Peterson," she said finally, "is this about having to leave the house?" The older woman set down the deed and reached for Lila's hands, holding them gently in her own work-weathered fingers. "Yes, honey. Unless we can find a way to pay what the bank says we owe them, we'll need to find somewhere else for you to live." "But what about Chester? And the garden? And all the people who come to see the plants get better?" These were the questions that had been keeping Mrs. Peterson awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine explaining to a child why sometimes loving something isn't enough to keep it safe. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we still have 30 days, and sometimes 30 days is enough time for things to change in ways we can't imagine." The corporate representatives had been circling the property with increasing boldness, their initial polite inquiries evolving into more direct expressions of interest. They had introduced themselves as representatives of Hartwell Agricultural Development, a company that specialized in maximizing the productive potential of underutilized rural properties. Their spokesman, a smooth-talking man named Mr. Davis, had begun stopping by regularly to check on the progress of the remarkable agricultural developments taking place on the Henderson farm. But his eyes always wandered to Martha's property, and his questions had grown more specific about water rights, mineral claims, and the legal status of various family holdings. "Beautiful piece of land," he had commented just yesterday, standing at the edge of Martha's garden with Chester eyeing him suspiciously. "Prime location for development. With the right investment, this whole area could become something really special." Chester had honked disapproval, which Mr. Davis had interpreted as charming rural color rather than the warning it was intended to be. Mayor Johnson arrived that evening with news that complicated an already difficult situation. He sat heavily in Mrs. Peterson's living room, his hat in his hands, and his expression carrying the weight of community leadership in hard times. "There's been talk at the county level," he said without preamble, "about declaring this whole area an agricultural innovation zone. It would bring in state funding, research grants, maybe even federal attention. But it would also mean regulations, oversight, and probably more corporate interest than we're ready to handle." "What does that mean for Martha's place?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "It means the bank might be willing to work with us if they think there's development potential. But it also means Lila and Chester would become part of something much bigger than what they've been doing. There would be restrictions, protocols, probably media attention that never goes away." Lila looked up from where she had been absently braiding Chester's neck feathers. "Would Chester and I still be able to help the plants that are sick?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Mayor Johnson said honestly. "That would depend on what the experts decide is the best way to manage what you've been doing." Chester honked with the kind of indignation that suggested he had strong opinions about experts managing anything related to his territory. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the Henderson farm, where the research encampment had grown to include facilities from 3 different universities and 2 federal agencies. Shouts and the sound of running feet suggested some kind of emergency, and all three adults found themselves hurrying toward the sounds of distress. They arrived to find Dr. Mitchell standing in the middle of the orchard, staring at equipment. Readings that made no sense according to any scientific principle she understood. Her colleagues clustered around monitoring devices that were registering impossible fluctuations in everything from soil conductivity to atmospheric pressure. "What's happening?" Mayor Johnson asked. "We've been trying to recreate the healing effect using water from Martha's well, Doctor," Mitchell explained, her voice tight with frustration. "Same water composition, same soil conditions, same plant varieties. But nothing happens. The plants respond to Lila's treatment, but not to ours." "Maybe," Lila said quietly, "it's not about the water." Everyone turned to look at the small figure with Chester at her side, both of them appearing remarkably calm in the midst of scientific chaos. "What do you mean, honey?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Lila considered the question seriously, absently stroking Chester's neck as she thought. "When Grandma makes biscuits, she uses the same flour and milk and everything that I would use, but her biscuits always taste better. She says it's because she puts love in with all the other ingredients." Chester honked agreement, and Dr. Mitchell found herself staring at a 6-year-old and a goose who had just articulated something that her years of scientific training hadn't prepared her to consider. "You're saying the healing requires something that can't be replicated in a laboratory," she said slowly. "I'm saying maybe the plants get better because someone cares about them getting better, not because of what's in the water," Lila replied. That night, as the research encampment settled into frustrated, temporary quiet, Tom Bradley made a decision that would change everything. He had been documenting Emma's remarkable recovery, keeping careful records of her improvement since she had begun eating vegetables from Lila's healing garden. The results were undeniable. Her latest blood work showed levels that her oncologist had described as miraculous. But more than the medical evidence, Tom had been moved by something less tangible. His daughter's return to childhood joy, her renewed faith that tomorrow would be better than today, her absolute confidence that the little girl with the magic wagon could heal anything that was broken. He placed a phone call to his brother-in-law, a lawyer who specialized in agricultural law, and asked a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. If someone's property has unique value that could benefit the entire community, are there legal protections that could prevent forced sale? The answer, it turned out, was more complex and more hopeful than anyone had dared to imagine. As Lila fell asleep that night, with Chester curled up on the rug beside her bed, the adults in her life were beginning to weave a plan that would require every resource their small community could muster, and every bit of faith they could summon, about the power of ordinary people to protect extraordinary things. Chester's behavior on Friday morning struck everyone as particularly odd, even by the standards of a goose who had already established himself as remarkable. Instead of his usual routine of greeting the sunrise with dignified honks from his favorite spot by the well, he spent the early hours pacing restlessly around the perimeter of Martha's property, honking with increasing urgency at seemingly random locations along the fence line. "What's gotten into him?" Mrs. Peterson wondered aloud as she watched through the kitchen window. Chester had stopped at a spot near the back corner of the property and was digging energetically in the soft earth, sending dirt flying in all directions. Lila pulled on her shoes and hurried outside, drawn by the intensity of Chester's focus. She found him excavating what appeared to be the corner of something buried just beneath the surface, something that looked suspiciously like an old metal box. "Chester, what did you find?" The goose stepped back proudly as Lila carefully brushed soil away from what revealed itself to be a rusted tin container, the kind that might once have held cookies or holiday treats. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived decades underground, was a collection of documents that would change everything anyone thought they knew about Cedar Hollow and the land that surrounded Martha's farmhouse. Mrs. Peterson arrived. Just as Lila was lifting the first document from the box, a deed written in the same formal handwriting as Martha's property papers, but dated 30 years earlier and describing a much larger tract of land. To William and Sarah McCarthy, Mrs. Peterson read aloud, and their heirs in perpetuity, all mineral rights, water rights, and subsurface claims to the territory bounded by... She paused, studying the property description with growing amazement. Lila, honey, this describes the entire town of Cedar Hollow, not just your grandmother's property, the whole town. Beneath the deed were drilling permits that had been applied for but never granted, geological surveys that showed extensive underground water systems, and correspondence between William McCarthy, Martha's grandfather, and various government agencies about protecting the town's water supply from unauthorized extraction. The final document in the collection was a letter written in Martha's grandfather's careful hand, dated just months before his death and addressed to my family and the people of Cedar Hollow. Lila read it aloud, her young voice giving weight to words that had waited decades to be heard. If you are reading this, it means the time has come to fight for what we have always known belongs to all of us. The water that flows beneath this land has been here longer than any of us, and it will be here long after we're gone. I have seen what happens when corporations take what belongs to communities, and I have done what I could to protect what matters most. The deed in this box makes our family the legal guardians of the water that feeds every well in Cedar Hollow. But guardianship is not ownership. The water belongs to the land, and the land belongs to those who care for it with their own hands and hearts. The drilling permits they will try to obtain have already been denied in perpetuity by prior claim. The water rights they will attempt to purchase have already been granted to the community through legal channels they will not think to examine. Use these documents wisely. Trust the land to tell you what it needs. And remember that some fights are worth having, not because we're certain to win, but because they are fights worth losing, if that's what it takes to protect what we love. Chester had settled himself beside the excavation site with the satisfaction of someone who had completed an important mission. His timing, Lila realized, was no coincidence. Somehow, the Goose had known exactly when these documents would be needed most. The implications began to unfold as Mrs. Peterson made phone calls to Tom Bradley's lawyer brother-in-law, to Mayor Johnson, and to Martha at the hospital. The drilling permits that Hartwell Agricultural Development had been quietly pursuing through back channels had been legally impossible to obtain for over half a century. The water rights they had been assuming they could purchase as part of any land development deal had never been available for sale. More than that, the drought conditions that had been plaguing Cedar Hollow appeared to be the result of unauthorized water extraction from neighboring properties, extraction that had been lowering the water table and disrupting the natural flow patterns that had sustained the area's agriculture for generations. Dr. Mitchell's equipment had been detecting unusual fluctuations, not because of anything magical in Martha's well water, but because the well was connected to an underground spring system that had been compromised by illegal drilling operations just outside the town boundaries. The healing isn't supernatural, she explained to the gathering crowd that had assembled in Martha's backyard as word of the discovery spread. It's ecological. The plants were dying because their water source was being depleted. When Lila started using water from the original well, the one that taps directly into the protected spring system, she was giving them access to the water they needed to recover. But that doesn't explain everything, Paul Henderson protested. The speed of recovery, the way the plants respond specifically to what Lila does, there's still something happening here that goes beyond just water quality. Dr. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. You're right. There's clearly something about the intentionality, the care, the relationship between Lila and Chester and the plants they're helping. That part, the love part, that's not something science knows how to measure yet. Chester honked approval of this assessment, and Lila smiled for the first time in days. The arrival of Mr. Davis from Hartwell Agricultural Development that afternoon took on an entirely different tone once the newly discovered documents had been filed with the county clerk's office. Instead of the confident corporate representative who had been making increasingly aggressive offers for local properties, he found himself facing a community that had suddenly become legally bulletproof. "I'm sure we can work something out," he said, reviewing the documents with obvious discomfort. "Perhaps a partnership arrangement or a licensing agreement for the use of the water rights." "Perhaps," Mayor Johnson interrupted, "you can explain why your company has been extracting water from sites adjacent to our protected watershed without the proper permits." Mr. Davis's smooth composure cracked visibly. "I'm sure any irregularities in our preliminary operations can be resolved through proper channels." "The proper channel," Tom Bradley's brother-in-law said firmly, "is immediate cessation of all unauthorized drilling activity and full restoration of any environmental damage caused by illegal extraction operations." Chester had positioned himself between Mr. Davis and the well, his posture making it clear that corporate representatives were no longer welcome near the source of Cedar Hollow's renewal. As the sun set over gardens that were thriving for the first time in years, the community gathered around Martha's kitchen table to study the documents that had changed everything. The deed that established perpetual protection for the water rights. The geological surveys that proved the connection between the illegal drilling and the area's agricultural problems. The permits that had been denied decades ago and could never be legally overturned. But most important of all, they studied William McCarthy's letter with its quiet wisdom about guardianship versus ownership, about fighting for what matters, and about trusting the land to tell you what it needs. "Grandma's going to want to hear about this," Lila said, holding Martha's wedding ring up to catch the lamplight. For the first time in weeks, the ring wasn't going to need to be sold to pay bills that couldn't otherwise be covered. Chester honked. Agreement. And outside the kitchen window, the red wagon sat ready for tomorrow's work, in a garden that was finally safe to flourish. The community meeting at Cedar Hollow Elementary School drew the largest crowd anyone could remember. Folding chairs filled the gymnasium, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallways. 3 generations of families, who had called the area home, sat beside newcomers who had arrived hoping to witness or understand what had been happening in their small corner of the world. At the center of the gathering, displayed on a card table covered with Martha's best tablecloth, were the documents Chester had helped uncover, legal proof that the community's water belonged to the community, and that the struggles of the past several years had been caused by forces that could now be challenged in court. Tom Bradley's brother-in-law, whose name was David, and who had driven down from the state capitol with a briefcase full of environmental law precedents, addressed the assembled crowd with the careful precision of someone who understood that hope could be fragile if not handled properly. "The legal situation is clear," he explained. "Hartwell Agricultural Development has been operating without proper permits and in violation of water rights that have been legally protected since 1952. We have grounds for both criminal charges and civil damages that could more than compensate the community for the agricultural losses of the past several years." A cheer went up from the crowd, but David raised his hand for continued attention. "However, legal victory in court is only part of what we need to accomplish. We also need to restore the ecological balance that has been disrupted, and we need to establish protections that will prevent this kind of exploitation from happening again." Lila sat in the front row with Chester beside her chair, both of them somewhat overwhelmed by the attention that had been focused on them since the document's discovery. People kept approaching to thank her for saving the town, a description that made her uncomfortable because it suggested she had done something heroic when all she had really done was help plants that needed help. Dr. Mitchell had spent the weekend analyzing water samples from the restored areas around town, documenting the improvement in soil quality and plant health that had followed the cessation of unauthorized drilling. Her findings would form part of the legal case against Hartwell, but more importantly, they provided a roadmap for the community's agricultural recovery. The spring system that feeds into Martha's Well is the heart of the watershed, she explained, using charts and maps to illustrate the underground network that connected every garden and farm in Cedar Hollow. When that system was being depleted by external pumping, everything suffered. Now that the natural flow has been restored, we're seeing recovery rates that exceed anything I've documented in 20 years of agricultural research. Mayor Johnson had been coordinating with state environmental agencies and federal prosecutors, building the case that would hold Hartwell accountable for their illegal operations. But he had also been working on something more personal, a plan to bring Martha home from the hospital in time to see her life's work vindicated and her family's future secured. "The medical expenses are covered," he announced, reading from notes he had prepared carefully. "The State Victim Compensation Fund will cover all of Martha's hospital bills and rehabilitation costs, since her condition was directly related to the stress of environmental damage to her property. And there's talk of federal grants for communities that have been affected by illegal resource extraction." The crowd erupted in applause, but the loudest cheer came from Chester, whose honk of approval could be heard over all the human celebration. Emma Bradley had been chosen to present Lila with a gift from the community, a new sign for Martha's garden that read Cedar Hollow Community Healing Garden in letters painted by children from the elementary school. But when she approached the front of the room, she was carrying something else entirely. "Chester laid an egg," she announced, holding up a golden object that seemed to glow in the gymnasium's fluorescent lighting. The room fell silent. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew Chester. Everyone knew that Chester was definitely, unmistakably male. Male geese did not lay eggs, golden or otherwise. Chester preened with obvious pride, accepting the amazement of the crowd as his due. The egg, for it was clearly an egg, despite the biological impossibility, sat warm and solid in Emma's small hands, its surface reflecting light like polished metal. "When did this happen?" Dr. Mitchell asked, approaching with the fascination of someone whose scientific worldview was being cheerfully demolished on a weekly basis. "This morning," Emma said. "He laid it right beside the old well, like he was making an offering or something, and look." She tilted the egg slightly, revealing words that seemed to be etched into its surface in flowing script. "New beginnings deserve new possibilities." Lila reached out to touch the egg gently, and it seemed to pulse with warmth beneath her fingers. Chester honked softly, nudging her hand with his beak as if encouraging her to accept this latest impossible gift. "What does it mean?" someone called from the back of the room. "It means," Lila said, her young voice carrying clearly through the hushed gymnasium, "that Chester thinks we're ready for the biggest miracle yet." The meeting continued for another hour, with practical discussions about legal proceedings, environmental restoration, and the tourism potential of what some were already calling the most documented agricultural miracle in American history. But everyone's attention kept returning to the golden egg that sat on the table beside the legal documents. Impossible and beautiful, and somehow perfectly logical within the context of everything else that had been happening in Cedar Hollows. The crowd began to disperse. Plans were made for the week ahead. The legal team would file injunctions to halt all unauthorized drilling operations. Environmental specialists would begin the process of assessing and documenting the full extent of ecological damage. And Lila would continue her daily rounds with Chester, tending to the healing gardens that had become symbols of hope for the entire community. But first, there was the matter of Martha's homecoming. The hospital had agreed to discharge her on Wednesday, 2 weeks earlier than originally planned, once her medical expenses were guaranteed by the State Compensation Fund. Dr. Williams had been amazed by her rapid recovery, attributing it partly to reduced stress and partly to what he diplomatically called the therapeutic effects of positive community support. Mrs. Peterson had been preparing for Martha's return with the thoroughness of someone planning a military campaign. The farmhouse had been cleaned from top to bottom, the refrigerator stocked with all of Martha's favorite foods, and the garden prepared to showcase the miraculous recovery that had taken place in her absence. But Lila had her own surprise planned, something that would require Chester's cooperation and the careful timing that had become their specialty. Tuesday evening found Lila and Chester working by lamplight in Martha's garden, preparing what Lila privately thought of as the most important healing they had ever attempted. Using water from the old well and soil from the spot where Chester had found the buried documents, she was preparing a special bed for seeds that Martha had saved from the very first tomatoes she had ever grown on the property. "Grandma planted these 43 years ago," Lila explained to Chester as she worked. "She told me on the phone that she kept seeds from the first tomatoes because she wanted to remember what hope tasted like." Chester supervised the operation. With the gravity of someone who understood, they were preparing for the culmination of all their efforts. The golden egg sat nearby, serving as both inspiration and witness to their work. As Lila planted the seeds with infinite care, she found herself thinking about all the people whose lives had been touched by the healing that had begun with a rusty wagon and $1's worth of faith. Emma Bradley, whose latest medical tests showed her cancer in complete remission. Paul Henderson, whose orchard was producing fruit that agricultural experts were calling the finest specimens they had ever documented. Tom Bradley, who had quit his job in the city to become Cedar Hollow's first full-time coordinator of sustainable agriculture initiatives. But mostly, she thought about Martha, who had spent decades caring for this land and its people without ever knowing that her family's legacy included the legal power to protect everything she loved most. The seeds were planted by moonlight, with Chester honking a soft benediction over soil that seemed to shimmer with possibility. As they worked, other community members began arriving, not to help, but simply to witness the planting that everyone understood would be different from all the others. Dr. Mitchell documented the process with the careful attention she had brought to every miraculous event in Cedar Hollow, but she also participated in the quiet ceremony that had grown organically around Lila's work. Mayor Johnson held the lamp steady. Mrs. Peterson provided a thermos of hot chocolate for anyone who needed warming. The Henderson family brought blankets for sitting on the damp ground. By the time the last seed was planted and watered with the blessed water from Martha's well, nearly half the town had gathered in the garden. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Chester patrol the newly planted area with obvious satisfaction, the golden egg tucked safely under one wing. "Tomorrow," Lila said as the gathering began to disperse, "when Grandma comes home, she'll see that everything she planted is still growing." Chester honked agreement, and in the distance, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, promising a day that would bring Martha home to a world transformed by love, determination, and the kind of miracles that happen when communities decide to believe in impossible things. The red wagon sat ready beside the garden gate, its rust and squeaky wheels, badges of honor earned through faithful service. Tomorrow, it would carry Martha from the car to her favorite chair in the garden, where she could see for herself that some endings are actually beginnings, and that the most powerful magic of all is the decision to never give up hope. Martha's homecoming on Wednesday morning began before sunrise, when Lila woke to find Chester missing from his usual spot beside her bed. She found him in the garden, standing guard over something that made her gasp with amazement and delight. The seeds they had planted just 18 hours earlier had not only sprouted, but had grown into healthy seedlings that looked weeks old. The tomato plants stood 6 inches tall with true leaves already forming, and the soil around them seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn darkness surrounding the garden. But even more remarkable was what had grown alongside the tomatoes, flowers of every color imaginable, plants that no one had planted and that didn't belong in this climate, rising from the blessed earth like a celebration made visible. Roses bloomed beside sunflowers, jasmine intertwined with morning glories, and butterflies that should have been hibernating danced among blossoms that shouldn't have existed. "Chester," Lila breathed, "what did we do?" The goose honked softly and gestured with his beak toward the old well, where the restored water level sparkled in the early morning light. Whatever power lived in that ancient spring had responded to Martha's homecoming with a display of abundance that surpassed every miracle that had come before. Mrs. Peterson arrived to find Lila and Chester sitting in the transformed garden, both of them slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The practical concerns about Martha's arrival: would she be strong enough for the journey? Would the house be warm enough? Did they have all her medications? Suddenly seemed small compared to the gift that was waiting for her. "We need to call everyone," Mrs. Peterson said, reaching for her phone with hands that shook slightly. "Martha, the mayor, Dr. Mitchell. Everyone needs to see this." By the time Martha's car pulled into the driveway at 10 o'clock, half of Cedar Hollow had gathered to witness her return. But the crowd fell silent as Tom Bradley helped her out of the passenger seat, because Martha looked not just recovered, but somehow renewed, her step steadier than it had been in years, and her eyes bright with the energy of someone who had been given a second chance at everything that mattered. She paused at the garden gate, taking in the impossible display of blooming abundance that had appeared overnight. The scientific explanations that might have been offered seemed irrelevant in the face of beauty this profound and deliberate. "Welcome home, Grandma," Lila said, taking Martha's hand and leading her to the chair that had been placed among the miraculous flowers. Martha sat slowly, her weathered fingers reaching out to touch petals that felt real and substantial despite their impossible existence. Chester settled beside her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated events to their perfect conclusion. "How?" Martha whispered, though she seemed to be asking the question of the garden itself rather than any human observer. "Chester laid a golden egg," Lila explained, as if this provided all the explanation anyone could need. "And then we planted your first tomato seeds with water from Grandpa's well, and everything just decided to grow." Dr. Mitchell began documenting the phenomenon with the same careful attention she had brought to every Cedar Hollow miracle, but her scientific equipment registered readings that made no sense according to any natural laws she understood. The soil temperature was perfect for growth, despite the October morning chill. The light levels matched what plants would receive in ideal greenhouse conditions, though they were clearly growing in open air. Most impossible of all, the chemical composition of the soil had changed overnight to provide exactly the nutrients each plant variety needed to thrive. "This isn't possible," she murmured, reviewing her instrument readings for the third time. "Of course it's not possible," Martha said gently. "The best things never are." Chester preened his feathers and honked agreement, clearly pleased with the assessment of his work. The celebration that had been planned as a simple welcome home gathering evolved into something resembling a festival. Neighbors brought covered dishes and folding chairs, children played among the miraculous flowers, and adults sat in the warm sunshine discussing the legal victory that would protect Cedar Hollow from future exploitation, while marveling at the display of natural abundance surrounding them. Paul Henderson arrived with baskets of apples from his restored orchard, fruit that tasted like concentrated sunshine and carried the sweetness of hope fulfilled. Emma Bradley brought drawings she had made of Chester in his role as community guardian, pictures that captured the dignity and wisdom that everyone recognized in the remarkable Goose. Mayor Johnson presented Martha with a key to the city, the first such honor Cedar Hollow had ever bestowed, and announced that the town council had voted unanimously to designate her property as a permanent community garden and natural preserve. But the most significant moment came when Lila presented Martha with Chester's golden egg, placing it gently in her grandmother's hands like an offering of love made tangible. Martha held the egg carefully, feeling its warmth and weight, studying. The words etched on its surface, "New beginnings deserve new possibilities." "I think," she said, looking around at the transformed garden and the faces of people who had become family through shared struggle and shared hope, "that Chester has been trying to tell us something important." The egg began to glow more brightly. As she spoke, its golden surface warming until everyone could see the light emanating from Martha's hands. "What's it telling us?" Lila asked. Martha smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young woman who had first planted tomatoes in this soil 43 years earlier, full of faith in futures that couldn't be predicted but could be nurtured with love and patience. "It's telling us that miracles aren't something that happen to us," she said. "They're something that happen through us, when we care enough about each other to believe that impossible things are just things that haven't been loved into existence yet." Chester honked his approval, and around the garden the miraculous flowers began to release seeds on the warming breeze, carrying the possibility of new growth to every corner of Cedar Hollow and beyond. The transformation that followed Martha's homecoming spread through Cedar Hollow, with the inexorable momentum of spring itself. Within hours of the garden's miraculous blooming, reports began coming in from throughout the community of similar phenomena occurring wherever people had been touched by Lila and Chester's healing work. The Henderson orchard, which had been recovering steadily over the past weeks, suddenly burst into full bloom, despite the October season, its branches heavy with blossoms that promised fruit well into the winter months. Mrs. Peterson's flower beds, which had been struggling for years, overnight produced displays of roses and lilies that belonged in botanical gardens rather than small-town backyards. But most remarkably, the changes weren't limited to plant life. Emma Bradley woke that morning to discover that her hair, which had been lost to chemotherapy months earlier, had grown back overnight in thick, healthy waves that gleamed with vitality. Tom Bradley found himself with energy levels he hadn't experienced since his 20s, and a clarity of purpose that made everything seem possible. Throughout the town, people reported better sleep, improved health, and a general sense of well-being that seemed to emanate from the very air they breathed. Children played with more laughter, adults lingered longer in conversations with neighbors, and the pessimistic mood that had settled over Cedar Hollow during its troubled years lifted like fog before morning sunshine. Dr. Mitchell gave up trying to document the phenomena with conventional scientific methods, and instead began what she privately thought of as miracle journalism, careful observation and recording of events that defied explanation but demanded witness. "The water table has returned to levels not seen since the 1950s, she reported to anyone who would listen. "Every well in town is producing clean, abundant water. The soil composition has improved beyond anything I've seen in 2 decades of agricultural research. And the air quality measurements suggest we're breathing atmosphere that's somehow purer than what exists anywhere else in the state." Chester had appointed himself official overseer of the ongoing transformations, making daily rounds through town with Lila to check on the progress of various healing projects. His golden egg had taken up permanent residence in Martha's kitchen, where it served as both conversation piece and reminder that the most important things in life often defied logical explanation. The Red Wagon, meanwhile, had been retired from active service and given a place of honor beside the community garden sign. Children visiting from other towns would stand beside it for photographs, as if hoping some of its magic might transfer to them through proximity. But the wagon seemed content in its retirement, its rust and squeaky wheels now badges of honor that marked it as a tool that had served its purpose perfectly. The legal proceedings against Hartwell Agricultural Development concluded with a settlement that provided more than enough compensation to cover all the community's medical expenses, property damage, and environmental restoration costs. But more importantly, the case established legal precedents that would protect similar communities from exploitation by unscrupulous corporations seeking to profit from rural resources. Mayor Johnson found himself fielding calls from agricultural, research institutions, environmental organizations, and communities facing similar challenges to those Cedar Hollow had overcome. The town that had been forgotten by the outside world was suddenly being studied as a model for sustainable community development and environmental restoration. But for Lila, the most meaningful change was the simplest. Martha was home, healthy, and strong, with financial security that meant they would never have to worry about losing the farmhouse or separating from Chester. The community garden had grown to encompass nearly 5 acres, with plots available to anyone who wanted to try. Their hand at growing things in soil that seemed eager to support whatever was planted in it. Families from neighboring towns drove in on weekends to picnic among the miraculous flowers and buy vegetables that tasted like concentrated sunshine. A small museum had been established in the old general store building, featuring displays about the town's history, the legal victory over corporate exploitation, and the role that a 6-year-old girl and her Goose had played in saving their community. The centerpiece of the museum was Chester's golden egg, which visitors could view but not touch, displayed beside a replica of the red wagon that had started everything. Chester himself had become something of a celebrity, though he maintained the dignified demeanor that had always been his trademark. He allowed photographs and gentle petting from children, but he drew clear boundaries about his personal space and maintained absolute authority over access to Martha's garden. Dr. Mitchell established a permanent research station in Cedar Hollow, studying what she called community-centered ecological restoration and documenting the long-term effects of what had happened there. Her work was attracting attention from researchers worldwide, though she was careful to emphasize that the healing had resulted from human care and community cooperation rather than anything that could be replicated in a laboratory. As autumn progressed toward winter, the miraculous garden continued to bloom in defiance of seasonal logic, providing fresh vegetables and beautiful flowers, even as frost appeared on lawns throughout the surrounding area. The old well maintained its perfect temperature year-round, and the water it provided seemed to carry properties that supported not just plant growth, but general health and well-being for anyone who drank it. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was visible in the faces of Cedar Hollow's residents. Expressions that had been marked by worry and resignation now showed confidence, hope, and the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from being part of something larger and more meaningful than individual concerns. Chester honked his approval of this development every morning as he made his rounds, and Lila smiled as she walked beside him, knowing that they had helped their community remember something important, that the most powerful force in the world is people who care about each other, deciding to work together to protect what they love. 1 year later, Cedar Hollow had become the kind of place people wrote about in travel magazines and academic journals, though it had never lost the comfortable feeling of a small town where neighbors still knew each other's middle names and children played until the streetlights came on. Lila, now 7 years old and slightly taller, but no less serious about her responsibilities, made her morning rounds with Chester through gardens that had become legendary for their abundance and beauty. The Goose had grown more dignified with fame, if such a thing were possible, and carried himself with the awareness that he had become a symbol of hope for people far beyond the boundaries of their small community. The red wagon had been restored, and placed in the town square as a permanent monument, its bright red paint gleaming and its wheels oiled so they no longer squeaked. A bronze plaque beside it read, "In memory of the faith of a child and the wisdom of a goose, who reminded us that miracles grow from love, care, and the courage to believe in impossible things." But the working wagon, a newer model that Chester had approved after careful inspection, still made daily rounds through the community, though its cargo had evolved from dying plants to seeds, seedlings, and small gifts that Lila distributed to anyone who seemed to need encouragement. Martha had recovered completely from her heart condition, something her doctors attributed to reduced stress, excellent nutrition from the miraculous garden, and what Dr. Williams diplomatically called the therapeutic effects of living in a supportive community environment. She had become something of a celebrity herself, featured in magazines about sustainable agriculture and interviewed by researchers studying the connection between community well-being and individual health. But she remained most proud of her role as Lila's grandmother and Chester's unofficial manager, responsibilities she approached with the same quiet dedication she brought to maintaining the garden that had become the heart of Cedar Hollow's transformation. The community garden had expanded to include an educational center where visitors could learn about sustainable farming practices, water conservation, and what Dr. Mitchell had termed regenerative community development. School groups came from across the region to study how a small town had successfully fought corporate exploitation and restored both environmental and economic health through cooperation and determination. Chester's golden egg had produced several smaller eggs over the course of the year, each appearing at moments when the community faced new challenges or celebrated significant milestones. The eggs were kept in a special display at the community center, where they served as reminders that some gifts can't be explained, only appreciated. Emma Bradley had remained cancer-free for the full year since her recovery, something her oncologist described as unprecedented but thoroughly documented. She had become Lila's closest friend and Chester's second favorite human, spending her afternoons helping with garden maintenance and learning what she called the secret language of growing things. Tom Bradley had established Cedar Hollow Agricultural Institute, a research and education center that attracted students and scientists from around the world. The Institute's mission was to study and promote farming practices that supported both environmental health and community prosperity, using Cedar Hollow's transformation as a model for similar initiatives in other struggling rural areas. Paul Henderson's orchard had become a destination for agricultural specialists studying fruit production in restored ecosystems. His apples were now sold in specialty markets throughout the region, prized not just for their exceptional flavor, but for their symbolic value as products of land that had been healed through community effort and environmental stewardship. Dr. Mitchell's research station had evolved into a permanent facility affiliated with 3 major universities, focusing on what she had named holistic ecological restoration, the study of how environmental healing and community healing support each other in sustainable ways. But for all the attention and acclaim Cedar Hollow had received, it remained fundamentally the same place it had always been. A small town where people cared about each other and worked together to solve problems and celebrate successes. The morning that marked the first anniversary of Lila's purchase of the red wagon, with her last dollar, began with a familiar ritual. She and Chester walked to the old well as sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, carrying a mason jar that they filled with the sweet, clear water that had started everything. But instead of heading to gardens that needed healing, they walked to the town square, where another yard sale was in progress. An elderly woman was selling household items, children's toys, and garden tools, clearly preparing to move away from possessions that no longer fit her life. Among the items spread on card tables and blankets, Lila spotted something that made her heart skip. A small watering can with a long spout, painted bright blue with small flowers decorating its sides. It was exactly the sort of thing that would be perfect for watering seedlings or tending container plants. The price tag read $1. Lila reached into her pocket and pulled out a crisp, new dollar bill, part of her weekly allowance from Martha, earned through daily chores and garden maintenance. She had been saving for something special, though she hadn't known what until this moment. "Chester," she said quietly, "I think someone else needs to discover what they can do with $1's worth of faith." The goose honked softly and nodded toward a little boy who was examining the watering can with obvious longing, his mother explaining gently that they needed to save their money for more necessary things. Lila approached the boy with the kind of serious expression that always made adults pay attention to what she was about to say. "Excuse me," she said, "but I think this watering can is meant to be yours." She handed him her dollar bill and watched as his face lit up with the same joy she had felt a year ago when she first saw the red wagon. Chester honked approval, and the boy's mother began to protest that she couldn't accept charity from a child. "It's not charity," Lila explained patiently. "It's just passing along something that was given to me. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that keep moving from person to person, helping wherever they're needed most." As they walked home through gardens that bloomed in defiance of autumn's approach, past houses where families were gathering for breakfast and beginning another day in a town that had learned to believe in impossible things, Lila felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that the most important magic of all was the decision to share whatever gift you had been given. Chester waddled beside her with his characteristic dignity, occasionally honking greetings to neighbors who had become family through shared struggle and shared hope. The morning sun warmed their backs, and ahead of them, Martha's kitchen window glowed with welcoming light. It was, Lila thought, exactly the kind of morning that made everything possible.